Good morning, everybody. Good morning. The Lord be with you. All right, good. Nice to see you all. We're glad to be able to gather in space like this. Thank you for spreading yourselves out. I hope you can hear okay, and you should be able to see okay. You want to maybe adjust once we start whatever's going on the screen to make sure you're able to see. Fred is a documentary film person, and we'll be watching some of his work. We're grateful to be launching this Coming Together Sunday. This is the Adult Learning Hour at 9:15. Every Sunday we gather at this time for adult education and social justice forum. And they want me to remind you that there's a bunch of good stuff rolling out this fall to grow our faith and to grow our awareness. So I want to let you know that 9:15 is a good hour to come to church at Westminster on Sunday. Every Sunday morning, the Adult Learning Hour will convene either in the recreation room with adult education, which is just across the reception area. The theme there is building the beloved community, construction, restructuring, and repair. Social Justice Forum meets at 9:15 every Sunday in the Meisel Room down at the other end of the building. If you've not been to the Meisel Room, it's been rehabbed. It looks wonderful. I encourage you to be there. The theme at Social Justice is diving deeper so all may flourish. Diving deeper together so all may flourish. On Mondays at 7 o'clock, Matt Skinner, there's Matt back there, will be leading a program called How Might Christianity Be Good for Democracy? A good question this fall. There's a lot going on election-wise. Thank you, Matt, for doing that. That's online and also in person. All of these offerings I've described are hybrid, either in person or online. And Rachel Shield, Westminster's Director of Congregational and Community Engagement, will be glad to connect you to opportunities for small groups or spiritual growth. There's lots of ways we as adults can deepen our faith and broaden our awareness. We're grateful to have those of you who are in the room this morning and those who are gathered with us via the live stream. Thank you for being here. This morning we are welcoming once again Fred de Sam Lazaro, an award-winning journalist whom many of us know of as the executive director of the Undertold Stories Project, which is based at St. Thomas. He's been a regular correspondent, special correspondent on PBS NewsHour and also on the PBS Religion and Ethics News Weekly. Fred has reported from more than 70 countries, and I might note that he arrived back last night from one of those countries, having spent 20 hours en route yesterday to get here for us this morning. He assures me he's well caffeinated. Fred's work focuses on stories that we don't often hear in the news media, particular emphasis on social innovation, entrepreneurship aimed at alleviating poverty. He's back just now from Uganda, a country in East Africa, and I'm sure we'll hear some of that. He has particularly focused in recent months on our own city and our city's response to the murder of George Floyd and the aftermath of that and the racial justice issues that we know are so present in our lives as Americans. So we're going to listen to Fred. We're going to learn something about the kind of curiosity and commitment necessary to really make a difference in our world. He's preparing now to launch us into this year of learning together, of worshiping together, in which we will be looking at how do we build the beloved community. Fred's from Bangalore, India, an immigrant here as a teenager, a graduate of St. Scholastica in Duluth. 3 generations of his family now call Minnesota home. Fred, we're glad to welcome you back. I will, following your presentation, I'll moderate a question and answer for whatever time we have left. And just by the way, you may see hymnals out in the pews. Please leave those where they are. Those are social distance markers for worship. So we'll leave those there. Ladies and gentlemen, Fred de Sam Lazaro.
Thank you so much, Tim. When you spend 20 hours masked on an airplane, you sympathize and become in awe of healthcare providers, of whom 2 are in my own family, who do this around the clock with they don't get to take the mask off to sip their wine on the airplane. And I really got to appreciate just that one aspect of the sacrifice that so many of our healthcare providers have made over the last 2 years. As for being here, I've been a lector in church. And in the Catholic liturgy, your responsibility there is to clearly just read the scripture as it was written 2,000 years ago and longer ago, word for word. It is the word of the Lord, after all. Today, in this beautiful sanctuary, I'm here to present you with words I've written myself. It's a bit unnerving, especially when I consider the eminent persons who have been in this space to share their own words. And as a journalist, keep in mind that my job primarily is to ask questions, not to provide answers. Keep that in mind, Tim. But I am really honored to be here. Thank you for that introduction, Tim, and Elena, thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for the hospitality. Coming off our 20-year observance of 9/11, it's impressive to me how long ago it is made to feel by so much upheaval that has since roiled our world. It almost seems like we're living and riding a crescendo right about now. The earworm that has stuck in these years of late comes from the first line of that Beatles song, "I read the news today, oh boy." I won't sing it, unlike my dear friend Jim Peter. I only sing in the shower. Many of us actually dread the news these days, fire competing for headlines with floods or drought in our nation, earthquakes in Haiti and Mexico, the painful end of our 20-year engagement in Afghanistan. Note the neutral descriptors. The rancorous political debate and the rising social inequality, a lot of that defined along racial lines. And of course, the fast-moving, fast-morphing virus. I'll soon share with you some glimpses of how we haven't started to grasp its global toll. And all of the above leaves very little time, literally, in a 1-hour weeknight broadcast for much else that's going on beyond our borders, the slower-moving global threats, or even the impact that COVID is having in far-flung parts of the world. And it's those kinds of stories that typically made up the bulk of our work at the Undertold Stories Project until about January 2020. Stories about poverty and human suffering, of social inequality, essentially in distant parts of the world. And early in the pandemic, we learned to work remotely using partners that and friends that I've gathered over the many years in Asia and Africa to tell some pandemic stories, but it's a very tedious, clunky way to produce television. And then came May 25th, 2020. And I abruptly became a frontline reporter on one of the most told stories of the year. All of a sudden, Minneapolis became a microcosm of America, the epicenter for a country facing a reckoning on matters of race and social justice. So we pivoted abruptly to cover the hard news as it happened, rioting, the Chauvin trial, but also the undertold stories of this told story, which is really what we're set up to do. And I'll show you one such example this morning, along with a few video excerpts that will take you from Uganda to White Bear Lake, Minnesota, and then back to Uganda. It's really not a very tough thing to transition, as I've found in the last several months. Much of our content focuses on inequity in the world. And the George Floyd aftermath has really made our portfolio truly global. I'm often asked by people, how do you deal with the anguish, the human suffering you witness in your work, and not let it depress you? In fact, if you look at our website on undertoldstories.org, we are journalism's equivalent of the book of Job. My response is twofold. First of all, in the field, there's just no time for that kind of reflection. You're more worried about getting from point A to point B, beating traffic, coaxing security guards to gain access they want to deny you, preparing for power failures, any number of little things that can derail a television report. So you develop a sort of clinical dispassion as you focus on the elements you need to just craft your story. But secondly, when I do get to reflect on this work, I think maybe this is raising the profile of some of the most pressing issues of our time. On television and in the classroom through the Undertold Stories project, we try to put human faces to the issues and relatable characters so as to make the foreign less foreign to our audience. And we use, as often as possible, people you might call solutions providers or solution providers to drive the narrative, individuals and groups that have had some success or promise in grappling with the issue that we're covering. From smaller nonprofits, and I'll show you a couple of examples soon, or large Nobel Prize winning ones like Doctors Without Borders. They have taken us to the front lines of some of the gravest challenges around the world. So to some examples of recent work, and if you've watched these on the PBS NewsHour, my apologies. But I've also, as compensation, lined up some video that not Judy Woodruff or anybody at the NewsHour has yet seen that I will share with you. So there. The first example is a cut-down version of a surprisingly popular story because it's sort of a lighter, it's a lighter variety, but perhaps not surprising for our time, given all the aforementioned social upheaval. I figure maybe there's a hunger for something like this. My original boss in journalism, by the way, Dick Daley, is in our midst, and this is from Minnesota Public Radio about 500 years ago, and I'm very grateful for him being here. Learned a lot from him and would be eager to find his reflections on this as well. But here's a story, a lighter feature that gained a lot of attention, a lot of feedback. Rwanda.
Across the developing world, many schools lack not only books or desks, but something even more basic, water to drink for sanitation.
I grew up in a village in Uganda. Houses didn't have water, kitchens didn't have water, schools never had water.
So without water, there's a lot less education going on fundamentally.
That's what I'm saying.
Twesigye Jackson Kaguri founded Nyaka, a school tucked high in southern Uganda's mountainous region. It provides free education to children who've lost a parent to HIV/AIDS. Kaguri, who now lives in Michigan, vividly remembers those early years, still the reality for millions of children around the world.
Going to school at 7 a.m. in the morning and finish school at 5 p.m. without drinking a sip of water. When I set out to build schools, one of the things I was determined to have is clean water.
The Nyaka school's clean water comes from a rain collection system. The local community raised some funds to install these large tanks and provided material and labor. But a significant chunk of the funding came from an unlikely source.
We're going to do a hula hoop contest right now.
School fundraisers in suburban White Bear Lake, Minnesota. There's plenty of water here, but students haven't come to this event just to soak their teachers. It's an exercise in building empathy for children elsewhere who work literally, laboriously to fetch water for their daily use. The Minnesota students get a tiny idea of what that's like, carrying 2-liter bottles for a mile along the lakeshore, or carrying buckets of lake water a few hundred feet for a chance to dunk teacher Ben Butters, who helped connect his students to the Ugandan school. Butters teaches physical education at Mataska International School, part of the local district.
We just work together all year long, coming up with ideas on how we can conserve water at our school and in our town and at homes, and how we could teach that to the younger kids. And then we connect that to the global issue, where some kids their age have to walk miles for water.
His water curriculum and the Uganda connection was made possible by H2O for Life, a group that partners schools across the U.S. and Canada with those in developing countries and recently the Navajo Nation.
I had a friend in Kenya that asked me if I knew anybody who could help him because his community was desperate for water. Their kids were dying.
Retired Minnesota schoolteacher Patty Hall founded H2O for Life in 2007.
So I wrote a letter back and said, how much would it cost? And he said 700,000 Kenya shillings, and I kind of choked until I realized that meant $7,000.
All right, girls, come on in here.
By the end of the school year, Hall and her students raised nearly double that. Inspired, she founded H2O for Life and has so far helped about 1,800 North American schools create nearly 1,000 water and sanitation projects in low-resource settings. These projects are only half funded on purpose.
Well, I got good advice from a really smart man in the water sector who said, don't fund an entire project and make it a gift, because then it's not owned by the community.
Just before the pandemic, Hall led a tour group to some of H2O for Life's schools, including Nyaka, where 17-year-old Prima Nyabari played host.
Before we had water in our school, we suffered so much. We could fetch water from very far, carrying jerry cans from very far places.
So now you're able to use the time to do something else. What are you using the time to do?
We are using the time to revise our books, do our personal administration like washing, bathing, preparing books for the next day.
If we build a culture of kids, a generation of students that take actions and see others as equals and treat people kindly and give them the same dignity that everyone deserves, that's my hope for the whole world right there.
I am in awe of teachers, and it's not just because I've been married to one for 4 decades. Patty Hall called me after that broadcast, the woman you saw here, and said that they'd gotten 45 schools in the next day to sign on with them, just like the White Bear School did, and collected some $45,000 in small donations. So it tells you a lot about the hunger, and it tells you about the impact that storytelling can have in moving people. We'll go next close to home, and I'm the most recent in what you might call our Minneapolis as Microcosm series, and it's about housing and fairly self-explanatory.
The sharp rise in home prices across the country continues to hurt first-time buyers. It is widening an already large disparity in home ownership between white Americans and people of color, particularly African Americans. Nowhere is this gap wider than in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Special correspondent Sam Lazaro reports, part of our series Race Matters and Fred's series Agents for Change.
It's been a heavy lift that took years, but last month Tim Luckett crossed the threshold into a new home, a first step toward happily ever after with wife Melva and 6-month-old Milani.
It was great to finally become homeowners.
Why did you want to own a home?
We wanted to be able to, have her be able to play outside, have a yard, be able to take her out in the backyard, play out inside in the front, and have a home for her.
She wants to be on that yard right now.
Yes, she does.
The Lucketts nabbed this modest North Minneapolis duplex against tall odds. There's a severe shortage of homes, which has driven prices to record highs. And history has long stacked the deck against black home ownership across America, and in this market in particular.
Racial covenants did the work of Jim Crow in the North, all over the North.
For much of the 20th century, it was common to see provisions in Twin Cities real estate deeds that prohibited property sales to people of color. The practice was the subject of the 2019 Twin Cities PBS documentary, Jim Crow of the North. It featured historian Kirsten Delegard, who leads the University of Minnesota's Mapping Prejudice project.
If you're told all the time that the influx, that's the language that was used, the influx of a person who was not white into your neighborhood would bring down your property value. That was a real source of anxiety for individual people who maybe did not see themselves as racist.
Explicitly, such covenants are now illegal, but they've left lasting scars.
Just 25% of black residents of Minneapolis and St. Paul own their homes, a rate that's well below the national average, and notable because this is considered one of the most affordable metropolitan areas in the whole country, if you're white.
About 75% of white residents here are homeowners. The disparity has had consequences. According to the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, the median net worth of white households in Minnesota is $211,000. That same number for the state's black households is zero.
The way that we accumulate wealth in America is largely through our homes.
Jennifer Ho is Minnesota's housing commissioner.
If you weren't allowed to buy in more affluent neighborhoods, if you weren't given preferential pricing on your mortgage, if you bought a home and you had it taken away through eminent domain to build a freeway, you have been disadvantaged over and over and over. And so it is going to require decades of intentional work in order to bring that number back up and bring it up so it's on par with white home ownership here in Minnesota.
That's the aim at Project for Pride in Living, or PPL, where Catrice Williams helps clients build credit and develop both job and financial skills that she says many middle-class people take for granted.
In white communities, investments and owning land and real estate and all of these wealth creation tools and the knowledge around wealth creation they've had access to since the beginning of time. What happens with African Americans and money is we have been operating so long from a place of scarcity that when we get access to it, it's now I want to look affluent. And we don't necessarily have the foundational knowledge of what it takes to sustain that affluence or create that affluence. So we go with the next best thing, the look of it.
I would get paid on Friday and be broke on Saturday.
You okay?
PPL has helped 39-year-old Lilrica Barber on her journey to financial stability.
I was on food stamps before. I was homeless before. I was on drugs before. I was in an abusive relationship before. But me being homeless really made me realize, who's going to take care of my son? I don't think you can.
Today, Barber actually works as a counselor for PPL and earns extra income selling custom-made clothes online. She has learned to practice extreme thrift.
No impulsive purchases, going to the food shelves at times when means was low, cutting my son's hair, doing my own hair.
Was that a radical shift for you?
Yes. Yes, it was.
For years, they've lived in a 2-bedroom rental apartment that's cramped, but the stability has helped Barber's 11-year-old son, Malik, thrive in school in suburban Burnsville, Minnesota. Together, they set their sights on owning their own home.
I love hosting and cooking for my family, so having a nice-sized backyard.
My own area to play around in and 2 bathrooms instead of just one, and I do want a dog.
Last year, Barber was approved for a mortgage, an achievement that has since hit the brick wall of market reality.
You've looked at how many properties did you say?
Over 200.
It's been a roller coaster ride, she says, that has led nowhere.
I get all excited. I show my son. He visualized, okay, this is my room. I'm going to put my bed here. I'm going to put my dresser here. Yeah, my dog, that can be his little spot. We put the offer in and we don't get it because someone has come in and offered a cash offer.
Among the reasons for a shortage of affordable homes, investors have flipped many of them into rentals in recent years, and single-family zoning laws have prevented the construction of modest or multi-family dwellings like duplexes and apartment complexes. Last year, Minneapolis became the first major U.S. city to ban such laws. As for the Lucketts, even in the midst of unpacking, they've got one eye on the future.
I wanted to grow into a house and just keep growing as my family grows, instead of going and get this big house and pay all this money that it's not even worth just to say we got a big house. Like, no.
They're renting the other side of this duplex to help build equity toward that dream home. But the dream of equity across Minnesota's housing landscape seems nowhere near striking distance. For the PBS NewsHour, this is Sam Lazaro in Minneapolis.
Fred's reporting is a partnership with the Undertold Stories Project at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota.
I hope you get what I was talking about earlier, relatable characters. I don't think, certainly on television news, that we see young black people, young black families in what you might call the mundania of American life. We spend a lot of time at the Undertold Stories Project actually doing vetting for characters to drive these stories, to accurately reflect what we're trying to convey in an accurate picture of the story and the issue. My production colleagues at the project, Solveig Rennan and Simeon Lancaster, spend hours of their time doing this, and so do NewsHour producers with whom I'm often paired. Now I'd like to show you glimpses of our latest work in Uganda, which in this context can be any number, scores of countries in the global south today. We who won the lottery to live in the rich world have not been paying much attention amid our own angst to what people I talk to say is an unfolding catastrophe in so many parts of the world, way beyond epidemiological. The social and economic ricochets will linger far into the future, setting back progress against poverty and childhood diseases, child labor, aggravating the gap between have and have not among nations and within them, which is, of course, the root cause of so much instability in our world. I'll give you a glimpse of Uganda here. These are kids getting water, firewood, a knife sharpener, and a slum. Uganda. So far, about 2% of Uganda, fewer than 2%, 1.6 or 7, 1.7% of Ugandans have been vaccinated, mostly in fits and starts with random donated doses from countries which have vast surpluses, doses that are about to expire. Anyone over 18 is eligible for a shot, though priority is now being given to teachers so that schools may open. They've been locked down for 2 years, and you can imagine, as Uganda has endured long lockdowns, how excruciating this has been for a country in which millions of people, perhaps half the population, actually more than that, live hand to mouth as daily wage earners. They're paid daily and only on the days that they actually work. It's the next generation of this country that will arguably pay the steepest price, that will definitely pay the steepest price among people who survived the pandemic. Here's a few examples. These are two sisters that we met on the sidelines of a vaccination drive. I'm going to go back to that one. 11 and 12 years old, couldn't go to school because schools are closed. So they are out buying selling bananas, sorry. I come from the Mac culture, and this is not a Mac machine. So bear with me. Okay. We'll just listen to them. They're hoping to sell you bananas.
I loved studying. I really liked math and social studies.
That's the older one. She's 12 years old, and chances are when the schools reopen, neither of these two girls will ever make it back to a classroom. And it's because even though public education is free, there are fees attached to it, whether for uniforms, whether for other facility fees. It will keep them out of school because their parents could not afford it, parents who haven't been able to work. And it's going to create a great deal of hardship. And I'll show you another glimpse of what I'm talking about. 2020 was the first year in over 2 decades which saw an increase in child labor across the world. The International Labor Organization came out with a study that found 160 million children, some as young as 5, enslaved in labor. And more than half of the jobs they do directly threaten their health and safety. I'm going to show you a glimpse of what we found in a stone quarry just outside of Kampala. This is a 12-year-old girl named Evelyn, and she, along with her mother and 6 siblings.
Life is not okay. When I break the stone, sometimes I hurt my fingers, and sometimes the small pebbles fall into my eyes. And another time, a big one hit me in the head.
It is very dangerous work. They first of all, free up these rocks, and then sit around all day from sunup to sundown, hammering them into smaller pieces of rock. They get paid, the whole family, less than $1 a day on a daily basis, and that enables them to buy food for that day's meal. They manage to eke out 2 meals, mostly maize, and if they're lucky, they'll get some fish, which is the cheapest source of protein. Okay? And every 2 weeks, they've accumulated enough of this pebble material to load a lorry, a truck, and that will fetch them about $25. So that's every 2 weeks. So you get the idea of how precarious their existence are. It's dangerous work, as she said. She's been hit before, she's hurt her fingers. Can you imagine doing that all day? But this is what this child will do. She's 12 years old, and she's extremely vulnerable, particularly as a young girl. I'll show you one more example. One other thing that has gone up in the wake of all of this, you have a lot of young girls at home who are, first of all, locked down at home. Imagine being a teenager locked in at home. You are extremely vulnerable to a lot of influences, whether it's from the trafficking industry or just boredom. And I'll play this video for you to show you one example that we met in a slum. This is 15-year-old Esther, a good student. She went to work to help her family, and she got pregnant. And so what that means for a young 15-year-old in Uganda is when she is able to, when the child is old enough, she will go back not to school. And this is a girl, it turns out, who got very good marks in school. She wanted to become a doctor, which is a common aspiration, by the way, because the only adult that these children, many children actually see is a healthcare provider, a doctor or a nurse, when they're extremely ill. Otherwise, they're rarely exposed to role modeling and roles to which they might be allowed, to aspire, to dream about. Those hopes are dashed, and Esther, may well face the fate that the previous girl's mother faced. That mother is 36 years old. She has 9 children and is single. And what I've shown you are compelling but by no means extreme examples. And where do you begin to pick up the pieces which are still fraying off like those boulders over there in a country that is bracing itself for the inevitable third surge of COVID? I put this question to a young woman named Alana Kimbabazi, and she's one of a cadre of very talented activists who press on, often at peril to their livelihoods, or worse, because they frequently hold the government to account. And there are issues with transparency in Uganda like so many other countries. And in the face of such daunting challenges and setbacks, it's a litany that beggars belief, really. I asked her, how do you get the energy to press on? And this is her view.
I may not see what I would like to see. The equity I'm talking about, a health system that functions, a world where we have a collective interest in the priority of the poor, because we recognize that any of us could have been born poor. And I have this sense that I may not see it now, or even in my lifetime, but you're building something, and others will take it on. We'll get there. We'll get there as a world. I have a lot of optimism in our generation.
Now, the PBS audience will probably see that with the benefit of subtitles, which, even though you got a preview, you didn't get it, but I'm going to read it to you because it's important. And Alana said, I may not see the world I would like to see, the equity I'm talking about, the healthcare system that functions, a world where we have a collective interest in the priority of the poor, because we recognize that any of us could have been born poor. And I have this sense that I may not see it, if now, or even in my lifetime, but we're building something and others will take it on and we'll get there. I have a lot of optimism for my generation. Now, Alana Kimbabazi is a graduate of Wesleyan and Yale Law School, by the way, where she was the executive editor of the Yale Journal of International Law. Don't get the impression that countries like Uganda lack these agents for change. They do not. And finally, I thought I'd share something from our own library to help gain a perspective for these times that we're in. I'm partial to it because I extricated it myself from none other than Archbishop Desmond Tutu. We talked to him during the World Cup soccer tournament in South Africa a few years ago, a time when he was bemoaning the corruption and poor governance in a country, in the Rainbow Nation that he, Mandela, and so many others sacrificed to create. How things had barely improved for the black majority post-apartheid. What gives you optimism that things will ever improve, I asked. And I'll play you his response on video.
I've always said I'm not an optimist. I am a prisoner of hope, which is a different kettle of fish.
It's quintessential Tutu, a man I first met here at Westminster a long time ago. He went on to say that we as human beings are hardwired, his word, to do good. It was the theme of a book he'd written at the time with his minister daughter, Impo. Good, he insisted, would always triumph over evil. And that's why he remained a prisoner of hope. I tried to pin him down on the duration, which is excruciating for that outcome that we all chase, but failed to do so. Maybe you can do so with your pastors here at Westminster. How long do we wait for that triumph? And finally, this is a fun thing something I'm in the habit of doing during interviews in my work. I'll ask several final questions, but I assure you this is the final. I thought I would leave us back in my lecturing ways with brilliant words by others. This is written by about more than a century ago by Rabindranath Tagore, who was India's first Nobel laureate. He won the Literature Prize in 1913. I'll read it for you. If you'd like to close your eyes, feel free. I hope your eyes have been opened. Tagore wrote, "Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms toward perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake." Thank you very much for your attention, and Tim, I'm all yours.
Fred, thank you. And to see that footage from Uganda that was presumably just done in the last few days is really remarkable.
It's very raw.
Yeah, we appreciate your work. What you're doing is exactly what needs to be done in terms of sustaining the hope that we all have for change in the world. We will talk about hope and worship in just a few minutes when we get started at 10:30. I want to ask you an opening question. Then we have people with mics. Matt and Elena are here. We'll walk through. So if you got a question you want to ask or an observation you want to make, look for Elena or Matt, and they'll hand the mic to you. But I want to go back to where you started your presentation. You started talking about 20 years ago, the World Trade Center attack. And you're a journalist, and you've been on the international beat for a long time. What's your sense of the impact of both those 20 years and our withdrawal, the way it came, impact on American policy? Do you see perhaps any changes that might begin to address, instead of trillions of dollars into war, some of the issues we've seen here? Do you see any hope for change there?
It's hard for me to tell. As I said, I'm in the questioning business as much as anything. But from my perspective, when I deal with certainly people who work in poverty alleviation in sub-Saharan Africa and others, they see an America that is really schizophrenic in some ways as it goes from one administration to the next. And we've seen that policies, whether it's policies over family planning issues, go back and forth depending on whether Republicans in power or a Democratic administration. And so there is growing concern about a lack of continuity in what exactly America stands for. I'll leave it at that for the moment. I don't know if it fully addressed your questions, but America is a superpower in the field of humanitarian aid and official aid. How it gets channeled, what people can expect, has become less clear, based on, and mostly based on how the political winds are blowing, and the winds have gone in multiple directions and not in a single direction. And that unanimity that used to exist is less prevalent today than historically.
Okay. I want to follow up on that, unless there's a question from, okay. I'm glad there's a question back here. While you're heading back there, Matt, I want to just note that Tutu did speak here, Archbishop Tutu, at a town hall forum. Yeah, it was before my time, but and his theme, consistent theme, has been hope. It's what sustained him and Mandela and others, hope for change. Is hope something you hear in the voices of those children? And I mean, I know you heard from a Yale-educated leader, but from the folks who are really, literally in the mines and the pits.
You know, it's analogous to what I described about my routine as a journalist. I worry about being stuck in traffic, so I missed the critical interview with the Minister of Health of Uganda, you know, which was a real-life situation just a couple of days ago, and I don't have time to reflect. And if you are like the mother who sits breaking stones up, she just makes sure that the guy with her 3,000 shillings, which is less than $1, shows up so she can buy food for the day. One of the hallmarks of poverty is that it doesn't allow you the chance to sit back and reflect. And your hopes and your are informed by the horizon that you're looking at to meet your most basic, fundamental human needs. And so hope is a luxury for people who have the chance on a full belly and in reasonable health to sit down and exercise.
Prisoners of poverty don't have much room
to
get to the hope.
You're just trying to get by.
Yeah. Question back here, Sheila.
Hello, my name is Sheila. I presume there may be an idea that telling the stories is important, and that's why you do this. So what can I do to help to tell the story?
That may be for you, Tim, as opposed to me. Listen, I don't, journalism is not supposed to be an exhortation to any kind of action. It's my job, and it's not a cop-out. I'll get to the most intelligent answer I can muster to that. But our job is to provide clear information and hope that people take that on and get engaged with the issue. And that's part of the reason that I moved from a production house, TPT, the public broadcasting station here, to a university setting and online. And we bring this storytelling into the classroom. It's a generational thing to sensitize young people at a time when they're presumably at their most idealistic. And use storytelling to massage their imagination so that they can go out and find ways to engage with an issue, even if that just means being sensitive to it. And you do that in a classroom with a demographic that does not generally watch television or video, but if they're captive in a classroom and coerced, they will, and surprisingly, many of them get very, very interested. So that's our contribution to helping this content endure, to essentially bring clear information to people so that they just know it, so that the stuff is not as foreign as we might imagine, as we might think the geography is. It really isn't.
I do want to address the question, because we're in the business of exhorting people to engage and change. I'll be doing that in just a few minutes. But I'm thinking of our partners in Bethlehem, in Palestine, in the West Bank, in Christmas Lutheran Church, and in Dar al-Kalima, the college there that we're related to. Their thing is, we're going to be the hope. We're going to be the hope. Not just talk about it or describe it, but we're going to be the hope. In other words, we're going to be the very thing that we're hoping the world catches on to. We're going to be the change. And that, frankly, happens in as detailed a way. Hope is in the details. God is in the details. Love is in the details, with our neighbor here or with policy changes on a global scale. That's the pastor's response. I want to...
Can I follow up on that for just another...
Oh, go ahead.
Moment or two. One of the things that I found in almost 3 decades of doing this is some of the most innovative efforts to improve people's lives comes from the faith-based sector across the board. And the power of faith-based institutions, and particularly individuals, more than institutions, frankly. There's a lot of institution in religion that is self-serving in some ways. But the individual social entrepreneurs, whether it's a nun in Calcutta, not the famous one you're thinking about, but another one, Sister Cyril, who's revolutionized education, for example, the Jesuit priest who is resisting GMOs in Zambia, or the Presbyterian Church, which has made South Korea the most Christian country in the whole world based on its history. It's the first time that the church wasn't an extension of an oppressive colonial power, but rather was associated with the liberation of South Korea from its colonial yoke from Japan. Religion is hugely influential, and faith-based people who are walking the walk or walking the walk of their faith are just very impressive people in my library.
The first Koreans baptized as Protestants were by Presbyterians in 1884.
I know that.
That wasn't that long ago. Change can come in a few generations. Now, Fred, we've got a couple things texted in. One is that Fred facilitates people telling their own stories, which is what you do. And then our role, this listener says, is to respond to what we hear and do the work of changing systems and changing ourselves. And then you have a question here. You find and tell the stories of people who are solution providers, agents for change. Those are your words. How do you look for them? How do you look to identify solution providers? How do you listen for this, someone who might be an agent for change? Because we should be doing that in our world.
We read a lot. There are some resources that are not as high profile as they ought to be, but it's not hard to find them in any particular space, whether it's in human rights, whether it's in the provision of public health or healthcare services or education. And I read from other journalism sources, the Christian Science Monitor being one of our major sources. The Skoll Foundation out of Palo Alto does a lot of work with social entrepreneurs as well. They look at innovators and look at individuals, whether it's in Lutheran World Federation, Catholic Charities. I mean, there's some extraordinary people. It's not hard. We're just not conditioned, I don't think, to look for it because we've got so many screaming headlines at us every single day. But they're not hard to find.
Good, thank you. Question back here, Susan.
Thank you, Fred, for your work. And I'm wondering what, in your mind, how can we shift the paradigm in terms of how news is presented in newspapers, you know, on the daily news every day, those screaming headlines? How can we shift that so that your undertold stories really make the headlines? Those are the headlines that we're reading as opposed to the stuff that creates polarization among us.
I should, I don't want to overstate the impact of what we do, because what I don't do is inform people, except in rare occasions, such as the George Floyd incident, which is now called the murder of George Floyd, but it was the death of George Floyd on May 25th. I was on the front lines doing hard news. That's a completely different, as the Arch would say, kettle of fish than what we do, which is the more thoughtful, less deadline-oriented piece. So I don't have an immediate answer because there's just such a little shelf space in the store for this kind of material because it's being elbowed out by what's urgent in many ways. Now, arguably, there is more space on local television for this kind of more thoughtful and deliberative content in some ways. I don't have a good answer, for you. I happen to believe that news just inherently cannot be a profit center in companies. It just doesn't make any sense unless it's manipulated to ratchet up and get eyeballs to the screen. That's a distortion in my mind, okay? So, circling back, kind of what we do, we vet very carefully for characters to drive the story, and we put it out there. And it's a perpetual struggle, and it's not something I blame anybody for. It's the way that our media are set up in this country. I think some countries Great Britain being the primary example, are bastions of solid journalism. I wake up every morning when I'm in town and tune into Radio 4 on the BBC. And it's astonishing how different the content of what they're talking about is from what you'll find on the morning fare on any of our media channels, including public radio, which I also listen to. I'm rambling without any definitive answers, but there you are.
I want to follow up on that question. You began as a journalist in the NPR outpost up in Duluth 500 years ago. A lot has changed. There's what some call the democratization of media with social media. Is that a helpful thing in your view as a journalist, or not, or maybe both?
It's helpful because, as Dick will attest, when we had to subscribe to LexisNexis and wire services, it was tedious, it was expensive, you had to go deep and wait a long time to get your response, which today comes at your fingertips, from any number of search engines. The problem is the internet and social media have become a vast exchange of ignorance, misinformation, and just acrimony. And I just fear that we've lost our ability to discern. I think most of us have a keen sense. When push really comes to shove, there are institutions that we'll go to online that have credibility. And those are mostly the legacy institutions of the media. But in between, you have a lot of purveyors of falsehoods. And I don't know what the answer to that is.
And you listen to BBC, you've told us. What other media sources do you, as a journalist, turn to when you want good information?
Christian Science Monitor, as I mentioned, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, what else? The Washington Post. Bloomberg, believe it or not, is a font of they've got extraordinary reach into geography that others don't invest in. Somehow they manage to do it. So Bloomberg is part of my morning
Good.
diet.
I'm going to give the last question to Elena.
Hello. So, Fred, you are here as we launch into a program year that is focused on belonging and working for the common good so that all may flourish and building beloved community. In the reporting field, where do you see belonging? Where have you seen those coming together for flourishing? Where have you seen the beloved community come to life?
Oh, goodness. Most of the folks that I am focused on are outside looking to come in. And probably the most, if I bring you into a small microcosm, it's probably that nun in Calcutta that I mentioned, Sister Cyril Mooney. I won't take terribly long, but India has a long legacy of church institutions, Anglican, because it was British, but also Catholic. There were a number of Catholic orders that established footholds in India just so that their Irish soldiers wouldn't stray from the faith, who were in India at the time. The legacy of that are extraordinary institutions. Christians make up 2% of India's population, but they have a massive civic footprint, and a lot of it has to do with education. Well, Sister Cyril took over a Loreto school in Calcutta, which is where the children of judges and doctors sent their children if they were lucky enough to get in, because an English education in a convent or in a parochial school is considered your ticket to a good career. Well, when she took over in 1979, she said, henceforth, 50% of my admissions are going to be from children who can't afford to be here. We're going to do away with the luxuries, and the others are going to subsidize them. That was very, very successful. And then she started bringing children in who are at a third tier of just being completely outcast from the streets, bringing them in, giving them a bath. These are children who are not academically ready, but she gave them a sense of security, created what's called a rainbow program. And over the years, these children of judges and doctors, as part of their their curriculum were required to spend 2 hours a week at least with these children from the street, and that interaction and that sensitization over time has produced agents for change from the school. These children are activists against child labor, for example, which is pervasive in many parts of the world. So that's probably the best example from a small story of what is possible, but it doesn't happen quickly.
Great story to end on. Thank you very much, Fred. I hear the bells calling us to worship. We're grateful for your being with us today. Thanks so much, Fred.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Those of you in the sanctuary, you'll see the hymnals on the pews. Those are markers for social